So kiddos, now we're on to our first human system, which is the digestive system. And the digestive system is one of the more complex systems just because we have a lot of enzymes and what we call accessory organs and different kinds of structures that are associated with digestion. So this graphic here just kind of gives us a big picture of the main parts of the digestive system, both the accessory organs as well as what we call the gut, which is basically the tube all the way from our mouth down to our anus. So if we took a little bit of a closer look at the different parts of the human digestive system, which is our focus, by the way, we don't do a lot with respect to digestive systems of other organisms. We focus mainly on the digestive system of the humans. So when we take a look at our digestive system, one important thing to remember is that our digestive system is kind of like a continuous tube, as I said on the previous slide, that goes from our buccal cavity, which is the fancy term for our mouth, all the way down our esophagus, which is the tube that takes food from our mouth down into our stomach. And then from our stomach, we continue along into the small intestine, which is this convoluted, twisted part here. And convoluted just means twisted all up and folded to increase surface area. So even our brain has those convoluted fissures. It's all twisted and makes for more surface area. And that distinguishes us from a lot of other animals who have kind of a more smooth looking brain, not as much surface area for thought processing and those kinds of things. So continuing along with that small intestine, we eventually get to the large intestine. Okay, we go up and we go across. Sometimes we call the large intestine the colon. We go down, and then right around in this area here in the rectum, that's where all the material that we didn't digest is compacted into feces and then expelled out of the anus. So that blue line that I drew is a continuous tube. Sometimes it's called the gut. Okay, so if you hear that term called the gut, sometimes we think of that as just being the stomach, but it actually is that continuous tube from our mouth, from our buccal cavity, all the way through and down to the anus. Now, one important thing about the tube, which is actually called the alimentary canal. So sometimes it's called the gut, but the proper name for this is the alimentary canal. And one important thing about the alimentary canal, I'm not spelling that super well, but that's okay, it's on the next slide anyway. The alimentary canal is that it does not touch anything else in our body. So it's kind of like a donut hole. You know how like when you have a donut and there's like the hole in the middle of the donut? You can put your finger through that donut hole and your finger doesn't touch anything else. That's what our alimentary canal is like. So our alimentary canal literally is this tube. Okay, so it's not connected directly to our bloodstream. Food's not like floating around everywhere outside of our alimentary canal. So when we eat food or we drink fluid, it's restricted to that alimentary canal from beginning to end. Okay, so when we look at the other structures of the digestive system, we have the alimentary canal, and then we have what is called the accessory organs. So we have the liver, we have the gallbladder, we have the pancreas, and we have the salivary glands. Okay, so all of those are considered accessory organs. Now, you don't have to specifically know the different types of salivary glands, the parotid, the sublingual, etc. You just kind of have to know salivary glands in general. And then the liver plays a role in digestion. It also plays a role in other things like breaking down harmful materials, etc. And then our gallbladder and our pancreas. So in terms of what differentiates our accessory organs from the alimentary canal is that the alimentary canal does not touch anything else, and then food passes through the alimentary canal. Food does not go into our accessory organs, okay? So that's really, really important. You don't end up with food in your liver, you don't end up with food in your gallbladder, you don't end up with food inside your salivary glands. What those accessory organs do is they secrete material into your alimentary canal. And I'm sure if I ask you, what do the salivary glands secrete? Obviously it's saliva. So when you eat food, your salivary glands secrete saliva into your buccal cavity to help with digestion. The liver produces bile and then secretes bile into the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores the bile and then secretes the bile into the small intestine. The pancreas secretes pancreatic juice into the small intestine, okay? But again, you don't have food being stuck inside the liver and stuck inside the gallbladder, etc. So accessory organs are responsible for secreting materials that are necessary for digestion into that alimentary canal, into that tube, okay? So if we were to kind of stretch out our alimentary canal and stretch it all out, it kind of gives you the guideline in terms of length here. So this is kind of a weird looking diagram, but I kind of like it because it shows that this actually is a tube like we talked about. So here we have our buccal cavity or our mouth here. And then this of course is our esophagus. So that's the tube that takes the food from our buccal cavity, from our mouth into our stomach. And then of course we have our small intestine. So one thing you'll notice here is that small intestine goes all the way to here. So the small intestine in terms of length is the largest part of our alimentary canal, okay? So that's why it's all kind of convoluted and folded up inside your abdominal cavity. But if we were to stretch it out, it has quite a bit of length actually. And then from that small intestine, then we go into our large intestine, and then eventually the food that we do not digest, the material we do not digest. So that includes the plant fiber, the cellulose, dead cells, bacteria, all those kinds of things get pushed out of our alimentary canal via the anus. So the accessory glands, as we said, do not form part of the alimentary canal, but the accessory glands like the pancreas shown here are responsible for secreting substances into the alimentary canal to aid with digestion. So those things like the salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, all of those are considered to be accessory organs and they play a role in supporting digestion. So we have some new terminology here that is specific to the digestive system. And sometimes the terminology isn't what we kind of typically use when we just kind of have a conversation about food and eating. So for example, the proper word for actually taking food into our system is called ingestion. Okay, so we usually just refer to that as eating, but the proper terminology is ingestion, to take food into our digestive system. So digestion is actually the breakdown of food. Now there can be two types of digestion that we have to distinguish from one another. We can have chemical digestion, and we can have physical digestion, which is also known as mechanical. Okay, so physical, mechanical digestion, those two terms are kind of used interchangeably. Chemical digestion always involves the use of enzymes to actually break down food into their monomers. So if you remember from our previous lesson on biochemistry, when we talk about proteins, for example, as we break down proteins and digest proteins, in the enzymes help us break those protein downs into individual amino acids, and then we can use those amino acids to build proteins that we actually need. Okay, so that's chemical digestion. It's chemicals like enzymes being used to break down bigger molecules into smaller molecules so that we can use them. When we talk about physical or mechanical digestion, one of the best examples of that is chewing. Okay, so when you eat and you are actually chewing food, the action of the chewing itself doesn't actually break food down into the monomers. What it does is it increases surface area. Okay, think about that. You're chewing, what it does is increases surface area so that the food is exposed to our saliva, easier for us to swallow, etc. Okay, so chewing would be an example of mechanical digestion. And the proper term for chewing is mastication. Okay, so to masticate, so let me see if I can spell that. And with my, oh, that was bad. Masticate, so M-A-S-T-I-C-A-T. This is me trying to spell with the mouse here. To masticate is to chew, all right? So that would be an example of mechanical digestion. Another example of physical or mechanical digestion is when your stomach actually goes through peristalsis, okay? So it actually is moving and contracting and moving that food around, okay? That also would be considered an example of physical digestion. Absorption is the movement of nutrients from the alimentary canal into the tissues through the bloodstream. Okay, so once we get down to that small intestine, then we're going to have the movement of all of those awesome nutrients that we actually digested, and those are going to be moved into the bloodstream to our tissues so they can be used. Assimilation is the storage of nutrients or their incorporation into tissues. Okay, so when proteins get incorporated into, so amino acids get incorporated into tissues, that would be an example of assimilation. And then egestion is the elimination of undigested food from the alimentary canal. So ingestion is to take food in. Once it's gone through our alimentary canal and it's fully digested, whatever we couldn't digest or didn't need in our diet, then that would be egested when we have a bowel movement. So it would be moved out of our bodies when we have a bowel movement. So when we talk about the mouth, most of us just kind of talk about the mouth, but the proper name for the mouth is actually the buccal cavity. Okay, so that's this word here, B-U-C-C-A-L. Buccal cavity is actually the proper term for the mouth. So physical digestion starts in the mouth. Once you start chewing, you increase the surface area of the food that you're eating. You expose that food to saliva, and eventually what we form is something called a bolus, which is that ball of food that is prepared and kind of squished together so that we can swallow it, okay? So saliva is important because it does a couple of different things. First of all, it has enzymes in it, like amylase, that help us start breaking down starches in our mouth immediately. And the other thing it does is it's mucousy. So that saliva actually acts as a binding agent so that the bits of food that we've chewed up and increased the surface area of can actually be compressed. It's kind of like if you ever have made hamburgers or meatballs or wontons before, the filling for the wonton, and you add egg or something as a binding agent, and it makes the meat stick together. So this is kind of the same idea. The mucus acts as a binding agent for the food and kind of makes it stick together in that bolus. And the reason for that is that when you're ready to swallow your food, it has to be in that bolus form. If it's just in all these little particles scattered throughout your mouth, it's really difficult for us to actually be able to swallow that food. So that's what the whole point of creating that bolus is. Now, you have nerves at the very back of your throat that once you are done your chewing and your tongue, which helps with that. Your tongue helps not only with speech, but it helps with chewing and forming that bolus. What your tongue does when you're ready to swallow your food is it's going to push that bolus of food to the back of your throat, which is your pharynx, and then that's going to trigger the reflex to actually swallow that food and push it down your esophagus and eventually into your stomach, okay? So in terms of terminology, don't get pharynx and larynx confused. The pharynx is the back of your throat, okay? So if you kind of think of the roof of your mouth and back a little bit, that's your pharynx. Don't get that confused with larynx. Your larynx is here, that's your voice box, right? Okay, so that kind of bump, the kind of, we sometimes call that in boys the Adam's apple, that kind of Adam's apple part there, that actually is your larynx, and that's your voice box. So in talking about the pharynx and the larynx and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure you've probably all had that sensation where your food went down the wrong way and it kind of results in that crazy cough that you can't stop, and you're like hacking and hacking and hacking, and your eyes are watering, and you, as much as you try, you can't stop coughing. What's happened in that case is food has accidentally gone down into your trachea or into your windpipe instead of being swallowed properly into your esophagus. So if we take a look at the two flaps of tissue that help prevent food and fluid from going where it isn't supposed to go, that would be the uvula and the epiglottis. And so if we look on the slide on the left here, when you open your mouth and you see that little dangly little piece of tissue, but kind of at the back of your tongue, at the back of your throat, that actually is the uvula. And so when you swallow, the uvula actually prevents fluid from entering your nasal cavity, because of course your nasal cavity and your throat are connected, right? And then the epiglottis, which is this structure here, okay, so this part is the uvula, and then here's the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that when you swallow food, it will snap closed over your trachea to prevent food from going into your trachea and eventually into your lungs, which can be very, very dangerous. So when you end up with that crazy, something went down the wrong way and you're like coughing and coughing and coughing, that's because either fluid or food particles have actually snuck into your trachea and they aren't supposed to be there. So what happens is you have cilia, you have these little hair-like structures in your trachea, and when they are stimulated by either a little bit of fluid or a little bit of food particles going in there, what it does is it triggers a cough reflex. And that cough reflex, why you can't help it, is because it's your body's way of protecting you from getting food into your lungs or fluid into your lungs, because that can be very harmful and lead to infection or pneumonia. So those two tissues, the uvula and the epiglottis, those two structures are there to prevent that from happening.